Manet and the Impressionists are generally regarded as the initiators of modern art. Now, modern art is the many-faceted movement that began in the 1860s and lasted for just over 100 years. It is not a cohesive movement. It does not have specific stylistic characteristics. Instead, it is distinguished primarily by its rejection of the traditions of art. Now, by traditions, I mean the legacy, the way of doing things that have been passed down from artist to artist, teacher to pupil since the Renaissance. By the second half of the 19th century, artists began to question this standard and their traditional legacy. Now, why were they doing that? Why were they questioning this? Well, some artists thought that tradition had died. They thought that nothing else could be said with it. Others thought that tradition had become irrelevant to the fast-changing world of urbanization and industrialization. Also, the rise of photography played a part in this rebellion. Why should we paint things so realistically or so naturalistically when a machine can do it almost as well? Modern artists also rejected the superstructure of the art world, so they rejected academic training and salon exhibitions. These artists created a group referred to as the avant-garde. The avant-garde is actually a military term, and it's used to designate the forward units of an advancing army that scouted territory before the rest of the troops could occupy it. But here in art, the term is applied to these artists because they were the forward-thinking artists, and they were believed to have created art that was ahead of the public's ability to comprehend it. Now, it's important to understand that the modern art movement did not take over the art world overnight. Instead, modern art evolved as rule after rule was broken. So, for example, although realists didn't paint traditional narrative content or traditional subject matter, we can still see that artistic tradition played a role in realist paintings. So looking at the two artworks I have up here, I have Thomas Eakins' The Gross Clinic, which is in the realist style. And then we have, from the classical Greek period, we have Polykleides' Spear Bearer. When we look at these two images, we can tell that they actually treat their figures fairly similar. We can see that they've both studied classic figural models, and that the realists would not or could not reject this classical tradition in their work. So if we look at these two images, what do they have in common? Well, both depict the Western understanding of the male body and how it should be depicted in art. We'll soon see how the expression of the conception of the body changes in art. As we look at art of the post-impressionist movement, let us keep two things in mind. One, these artists are illustrating their rejection of tradition in their art. And two, as part of the avant-garde, these artists were looking forward or pushing their art forward into realms of creativity that had really never been ventured into before. The term post-impressionism was coined by the English writer Robert Fry in 1910 to refer to an exhibition that he organized in London, which introduced a wide range of modern French paintings to England. Some of the paintings included some by Manet, Cézanne, Gauguin, Van Gogh, and then some relatively young, unknown painters, which include Matisse, who will be very popular later, and Picasso, again, also very popular later. The public rejected this exhibit. They laughed at it, and they laughed at its content. Some reviewers used words such as anarchist, degenerate, and madman to describe the paintings and, by association, these artists. Despite the rejection, or the reaction and rejection, the term stuck, and it is applied to the avant-garde artists who began working in France around 1885 and later. Now, art historians consider this term problematic because it is retroactive, meaning that it was applied to this group of artists 25 years after the beginning of this kind of so-called movement. It's also misleading because it seems like, because they're given this title, that this group had unity. But this group actually had little or no unity and interaction. So it really wasn't like a group of artists working together. In fact, when they did interact, it was often a very negative experience. These avant-garde artists were jealous, they were highly competitive, and they were extremely protective of their ideas. Roger Fry saw the unifying force of post-impressionist artists as a reaction against impressionism. We basically use Fry's definition to categorize post-impressionist artists. He defined post-impressionist artists as a generation of artists who consciously emphasized and exploited the formal elements inherent in the medium. In paintings, they exploited decorative elements of color, line, and composition by means to convey or express emotion. Now, at the same time, post-impressionists avoided or played down the elements that tradition considered essential. But post-impressionists thought them to be unnecessary, like they didn't really think dimensionality was needed, or dimensional illusionism. They didn't really think you needed narrative content. If you wanted to see something that was three-dimensional, you can go look at a piece of photography. If you wanted to read something or enjoy something with a story, go read a book, go read some literature. They believed that the choice of subject matter was irrelevant to its aesthetic value. Now, overall, the post-impressionism is considered a reaction against impressionism. These artists reject impressionism's emphasis on the spontaneous recording of light and color. They reject, or instead they shift to create art with a greater degree of formal order and structure. Other artists push this even further forward from impressionism and develop more abstract styles. Now, there are several post-impressionist artists we could discuss, and they do talk about a few in your book. But we're going to talk about Vincent van Gogh. And the reason we're going to talk about him is because he is the most famous of the post-impressionist period. And after all, this is a survey class, so we should learn about basically the most important artists to the art canon. So Vincent van Gogh was an avant-garde painter from this period. And he becomes very famous, but he actually doesn't become famous until after his death. Van Gogh was born in Holland in 1853. And he was the son of a Protestant minister. He was described as a quiet, withdrawn child. He described himself as lonely for much of his life. He was very unsuccessful with the ladies. He was rejected by his great love, and this really impacted his mental state. We do think that Van Gogh definitely suffered from mental health issues. He held various jobs, all of which he was dismissed from. First, he was an apprentice to an art dealer, and this ends up being really good for him because he is exposed to many paintings, including those of Rembrandt and Millet. Then he works as a preacher in a Belgian mining town, and the thing with Van Gogh is that he is a really intense person, and everything he does, he dives into 100%. So when he becomes this preacher, in this mining town, he is said to have been so intense with his charity that he literally even gave away the clothes on his back. He just got really into it. So that didn't really work out for him. So then in 1879 or 1880, he decides to become an artist, and he begins studying textbooks on anatomy and engravings. He studies briefly in Brussels, The Hague, and Antwerp. His brother Theo basically sponsors him financially throughout his life. He, as far as we know, was very close to Theo, and Theo's wife is actually the person who ends up making Van Gogh's paintings famous later. There's actually a new article that the Smithsonian just put out recently about that, so you can read it and write a summary for extra credit. So, in Antwerp, Van Gogh discovers the work of Rubens, and he also buys some Japanese prints. He really enjoys Rubens and Delacroix's use of color. So like everything he does in his life, art consumes him. He's just like 100% intense about whatever he's doing, and he throws himself into it. He moves to Paris in 1886, where he meets various artists, including Monet, Pissarro, and Gauguin. Upon seeing their work, Van Gogh alters his brushstrokes, using the short brushstrokes of the Impressionist style. And he works in the Impressionist style for a brief time. But like Cezanne, but even more so, Van Gogh has a very unique personality. He was very passionate and very intense. This helped him produce some wonderful paintings, but it also caused him a lot of problems, and he had a rather unhappy life. By 1887, he became increasingly moody and temperamental, and he also took to heavy drinking. Perhaps at the recommendation of his brother, Van Gogh sought a change of scenery, and he went with another post-impressionist artist, Gauguin, who we'll talk more about later, and you'll read about in your book. They decided they were going to go to the south of France and start an art school. Now, like I mentioned before, when these artists get together, avant-garde / post-impressionist artists get together, it really doesn't turn out this very well, and the results of this, them trying to found a school, was a disaster. So basically, we don't know all the details, but we know that it ends with Van Gogh chasing Gauguin around with a razor. Gauguin gets away, but Van Gogh ends up cutting off a portion of his own ear. We can see that here in his self-portrait, that he has that bandage over his ear, because he's so distraught with how everything ended up. This was really the pinnacle of his downward spiral of his life. After this, he began shifting between madness, and then he would have lucid moments. The neighbors wanted him to be removed. They called him a madman, and he was eventually admitted to an asylum. He might have been schizophrenic, or maybe he had a type of epilepsy that infected him with paranoia. He was definitely did have some sort of mental illness. Oh, he actually did pretty well in the asylum. He created some 200 paintings, and his art actually continued to progress and evolve there. So it was a really productive time for him, and he did seem to be improving. He ends up leaving the asylum after his mental state seems to improve and his work thrives, but it doesn't last long. In 1890, Van Gogh ends his own life by shooting himself, and then he dies 2 days later. Van Gogh actually only sold one painting in his lifetime for 400 francs, which is not a lot of money, and he never knew fame or fortune. What he left behind was a series of paintings that show his artistic evolution and his true avant-garde push of modern art. Some of his paintings took divisionalism or pointillism and impressionism and modeled these styles into a highly expressive style. A style that violently or forcefully conveyed his emotions. Soon after his arrival in Paris, he began using pointillism. In the interior of a restaurant, we can see that Van Gogh's interpretation of pointillist techniques. So it's not like Seurat's, where we have this very static, stiff composition. We still have that use of dots, but he's created something that looks, yes, very structured, but more like the Impressionists. But he's not really, he is influenced by the Impressionists. And he loves the way that they filter the summer light and highlights and things like that, but he's not really interested in their momentary effects of light and atmosphere. In this painting, it is really evident that Van Gogh is not satisfied with Seurat's dot technique, and he's experimenting and trying to see how he wants to use those techniques in his art. So he's using dots here, but they are much less precise and more painterly. And I just bring in this image so you can kind of remember what Seurat's looks like and how they do look different. This does look way more impressionistic than this, but it's not one of those fleeting exterior moments that we're so used to seeing with Impressionism.